Hello, Eternal Family. Welcome to Post-Mormon Postmortem, the podcast where we lovingly sift through the ashes of our former faith, one bizarre belief and repressed memory at a time. My name is Hannah, and this is a mini bonus episode only on YouTube as a follow-up to a TikTok I just posted about the case of Tanya Adams, and I wanted to talk about the entire story. If you missed the premise on TikTok, I will catch you up here. In 1979, we are in Washington State. Tanya Adams was 24. Her husband, John Adams, had just left her for another woman. She had 2 toddlers, no income, and a theology that had an answer for all of it. So as I said, it's 1979, and we're in Washington State, and 24-year-old Tanya Adams has just walked into the Pasco police station and told officers that she had thrown her children from the new cable bridge that linked the towns of Pasco and Kennewick into the Columbia River about 4 a.m. the previous day. She told the officers that she hadn't heard a cry from either of them. They had just gone kaplunk when they hit the water. The investigation that followed and then the trial that resulted produced a legal quandary around the insanity defense. Because obviously this wasn't a case of concealing the facts or disputing the facts. Tanya Adams told the police what she had done. She described it in detail on a tape that was later played in court at her trial. The basic account was uncontested. As these cases of insanity do, it turned on the question of what it means to know what you are doing. Tanya Ann Adams was born Tanya Ann Gwynn in Yugoslavia. Her mum died when she was young, and when she was 6, her dad sent her to the US to live with relatives on the West Coast who adopted her. So Tanya grew up in a small timber and fishing town in Washington called Hoquiam. She graduated from Hoquiam High School in 1972. When the event hit the papers, her high school principal, Don Spencer, remembered her as a super gal and a dang good student. And that's a direct quote. A dang good student. By the time she was in her early 20s, she was living in Pasco. She was working as a waitress at a Kennewick restaurant. And before that, she had been selling vacuum cleaners. But also somebody at the trial testified who said that she was a former college friend. So at some point, there must have been some college in there. I haven't gone that far into the backgrounds. I apologize. A co-worker, fellow server at the restaurant, Betty McConkle, said that Tanya was the most honest waitress that she had ever worked with. She was the only one in the entire place who turned in every penny of her tips at the end of the night, right down to the cent. Her neighbor, Hannah Hosley, babysat Tanya's little boys, Ryan and Christopher, regularly from the late summer through just after Christmas while Tanya was working at the restaurant. And then I think she was having a hard time holding it together emotionally, and she just couldn't get out of bed, and she wasn't leaving the house, hence her no longer needing childcare. But while she did, the neighbor babysat for her and said that Tanya always seemed genuinely pleased to see her boys at the end of a shift. And then it was her, as I said, college friend, Leslie Perrin, who had known Tanya for 8 years, who described her as one of the best mothers she had ever seen. She was patient, attentive, and slow to raise her voice. Outside the family's trailer at the Lakeview Trailer Court in Pasco, a bright yellow mailbox proudly read, "The John P. Adams Family," with all 4 names listed. But John Adams had not lived there for at least 3 months since he left at Thanksgiving. John P. Adams was 38 in 1979, a 1968 graduate of Pasco High School and a salesman. He had been a devout Mormon, raised in the church, gone on a mission, but it came out that he said during the trial he had been excommunicated from the church for his human failings. We've all got them, John, but they're just not allowed in the church. You know that, right? The natural man is an enemy to God. Around Thanksgiving, Tanya discovered that he was having an affair, and then he left, as I said, for another woman, and went to Yakima, Washington for work. And after he left, Tanya found herself in a real constraint, financially and emotionally. Materially, the car was having difficulties. The hot water tank in the trailer didn't work. rent was coming due, creditors were threatening to repossess their mobile home. So I don't know why it says rent was due, because I'm just reporting what the paper said. Let's not split hairs. It is contradictory, but we'll just go with it. The family apparently, according to John, had like $12,000 of debt, and John told Tanya not to worry about it, that he was going to handle the bills from Yakima, but he was in Yakima and he was not handling the bills. Tanya, by multiple accounts, was too proud to apply for welfare. Her defense attorney, J.D. Evans, summarized the circumstances for the jury. He says, her car broke down, the rent was due, they were threatening to repossess her trailer home, finally she just broke. Yeah, she was having a real case of the Mondays. We know people don't just, there's no such thing as just snapping with no warning, right? There's always signs along the way. And there were many in this case. The months between Thanksgiving, 1978, when John left, and then February in 1979, when Tanya committed the murders, was a period of progressive isolation. Like I said, Tanya eventually just stopped leaving the house and stopped working. And friends and co-workers and family said that every single conversation she had always been extremely devout, but it became even more so now. Every conversation turned to religion. And John Adams said that religion so dominated their conversations and interactions. He's like, she was banging me over the head with it all the time. That was his direct quote. Now, this is freaking lovely. When John testified in trial, he said that her attitude, Tanya's attitude, took a, quote, sinful turn when he left her. It's like, oh, what? Her attitude took a sinful turn? She wasn't delighted that you were leaving her for another woman? Anyway, so John said on the stand, every time I went over there or called her, religion would be the subject of conversation, to the point of what I call banging me on the head. And then it goes on to say that his wife had become, quote, very down, and her attitude grew negative, bad, sinful. Back to her co-worker Betty McCorkle, who had testified how scrupulously honest Tanya was. She also said in her testimony that Tanya never directed any anger at John after he left. She absorbed all of it herself. She kept saying, if I had just kept my hair looking better, if I hadn't gained this weight during my pregnancies. I mean, she had a 2.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. So first of all, you've got your kids spaced 1 year apart, and that doesn't probably give you much time to recover physically. But she felt that John would not have left had she maintained pretty hair and a more slender figure. She felt she had committed the transgressions. About 3 weeks before February 5th, she stopped going to work, as I said. She locked herself in the trailer, and her neighbor, Hannah Hosley, the same one who used to babysit the boys for her, started doing her grocery shopping. The trailer park manager, Fern Trontham, said that they had just kept entirely to themselves and she hadn't seen them at all. As listeners of this podcast already know, in Mormon theology, 8 is the age of accountability, the age that you become responsible for sin. So that's why you get baptized then, and at that point, your spiritual debt begins to accumulate. If you die before you're 8, you are considered sinless, and you are guaranteed entry into the celestial kingdom, the highest degree of heaven in Mormon cosmology. Tanya was a devout member of the church. She believed it. According to psychiatric testimony presented at her trial, she also believed that she had sinned beyond repentance. Her bishop, Wayne Monson, testified that she had made a written list of every sin she could recall. Oh my God, it's like 12 steps. And brought it to him for review. He went through the list with her and told her that there was nothing on it that was that serious, but she didn't believe him. She had become convinced that Ryan at 2.5 and Christopher at 1.5 were going to grow up under the influence of 2 irredeemably wicked people, herself and their father, and would consequently miss their opportunity for celestial glory. Probadrew. Okay, the defense put on a psychiatrist, Dr. Regina Probadrew, who testified that Tanya believed that if the boys grew up sinful, she, as their mother, would be held accountable for their sins. Why did she think that? Well, you know that there is a scripture out there that says that the sins of the children will be on the head of the parents if the parents don't educate them properly. Can I be bothered to go and find the actual scripture that I'm talking about? No. So both boys were still under 8, sending them to the celestial kingdom, before the world could corrupt them was not, in Tanya's reasoning, a crime against them. It was actually fulfilling a maternal obligation. She was giving them the best thing possible, guaranteed entry into the celestial kingdom. Then she was faced with another doctrinal constraint, and that is suicide. She considered jumping from the bridge herself, but said that she chose not to because, according to her LDS theology, suicide is one of the gravest sins, and that would keep her out of the celestial kingdom, she believed. So the boys needed to go. She couldn't follow them. She would remain behind and face the legal consequences, which she understood with apparent clarity. She told the police when she turned herself in that she knew murderers in Washington state were hanged and that she was ready to accept that punishment. So all of this weighs into an insanity defense. I want to give a shout out to Tanya's Bishop, Wayne Monson, and her home teacher, Dick Gibson, because they both testified at trial, and it seems clear to me that they were at least aware that Tanya was in mental dire straits and needed help. I don't think they really did anything helpful about that situation, but they tried. In January 1979, her bishop said that he was aware that something was seriously wrong. He thought that Tanya was mentally ill and potentially suicidal. So he arranged on 2 separate occasions for an appointment with a psychiatrist for her, but she didn't go to either appointment, which is really not surprising considering the state that she was in. So, I mean, probably going to have to drive somebody there yourself to make it happen, I'm guessing. Home teacher, a man named Dick Gibson, who testified, said that he thought Tanya was on the verge of being completely crazy and suicidal. Bishop Monson also testified that Tanya had told him she believed he was going to come and take her children away because he understood her evilness. I mean, she had gone through her 12-step inventory with him. She was anticipating an intervention, and she appeared to think that she was dangerous and was waiting for someone to act on that information. And he told her, your kids need you. They need you to be with them. They need to be with you. I'm not taking your kids anywhere. So he arranged the psychiatric appointments that she didn't go to. And, credit for where it's due for seeing an issue and trying to address it, but clearly just making an appointment for someone with no childcare or money and unreliable transportation and mental health issues who can't leave the house and expecting them to keep it. That's a little naive. Dick Gibson, in his testimony, offered this assessment. He said, if there is guilt to be shared on this, then it's on a lot of people. So on February 4th, Tanya spent the full day driving around Pasco and Kennewick with Christopher and Ryan in the car. Every time she stopped, she kept the engine running so the boys would stay warm. She parked at a series of locations that she chose deliberately. In the hospital parking lot, at a senior citizen centre adjacent to the hospital. She said she picked spots where she knew she wouldn't get stuck in the snow and where no one would know what she was doing. And again, would we weight this into the insanity defense? She twice during that day bought food for the boys. At some point, she attempted to freeze them. She packed them into a snowbank outside, and then one of them started crying, and so she said she couldn't go through with it, and she brought them back inside. She drove across the cable bridge multiple times, trying to stop, but each time there were other cars present, and so she waited. She said, on the tape later played in court, that she knew it was getting light, and it would have to be done that day or not at all. Her words were either they, I, or us 3 would have to go. At 4 a.m., she pulled over at what seemed to her to be the middle of the bridge. There were no other cars. She got Christopher first. He was sleeping. She carried him to the railing and dropped him 40 feet into the Columbia River, which was running fast and cold because it's February now and the snow's starting to melt off. Then she walked back to the car and got Ryan, who was also asleep. She carried him to the railing and threw him over. She had bundled both of them in coats and hats beforehand, and she said she kissed them. On the tape, she says, I just told myself it had to be done, and I did it. Police Lieutenant Glenn Butner told reporters there was no chance either boys could have survived the fall or the exposure, obviously, but they had divers looking for their bodies. Tanya contemplated whether or not she was going to jump, and she decided not to. Approximately at 2 o'clock that following afternoon, she drove to the Pasco police station and she turned herself in to officers Archie Pittman and Mike Dickinson. She said she wanted to confess to murdering her children, and they initially did not believe her, but she was insistent and specific, making her account impossible to dismiss, the papers say, which I hope they wouldn't have anyway. Rescue squads from Benton and Franklin counties searched the river that evening and found nothing. The river was moving really quickly. A diver at the scene told reporters the bodies might not even surface until spring. Tanya was taken to Eastern State Hospital on a 4-day psychiatric hold for evaluation. No charges were immediately filed against her because they didn't have any recovered bodies. So I guess essentially at that point, there's no crime, just an admission of a crime, but no evidence of it. I don't know. The case attracted national attention and eventually the attention of a grandmother from New Jersey who claimed that she had the ability to locate missing children through her psychic means. And the fact that this was printed in the paper is just sort of so telling of the time, that the paper just reports as fact that she provided investigators with information about when and where the boys would be found. And then, what do you know, on March 21st, a man followed her clues and found Ryan's body washed ashore 7 miles downstream from the bridge. And then 11 days later, they found Christopher near Hat Rock Park in Oregon, 35 miles south of Pasco. Tanya was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. She pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Because of the extent of the pre-trial publicity, the case was moved to King County Superior Court in Seattle, and the trial started that October. Her defense attorneys were J.D. Evans and Greg Lawless, which is a great name for a defense attorney. I'm sure everybody he ever met said that to him. They didn't contest that Tanya had thrown her children from the bridge. The defense and prosecution agreed on those facts. The disagreement was over the legal significance of what Tanya believed that she was doing. Her defense attorney, J.D. Evans, opened by telling the jury that his client was insane and delusional and that she had attempted to kill her children without causing them pain. First by freezing them in a snowbank, and then after hours of driving and buying food, and finally she tossed them off a bridge. He also said that she had become so dazed and confused and depressed and irrational and despondent that she was unable to carry on. And 4 medical experts, including a psychologist and a psychiatrist, were going to testify that she was legally insane on February 4th and 5th. Stan Moore, the prosecutor, opened by telling the jury that Tanya Adams knew she was committing murder, and she knew she would be punished for it, and that she had told the police that she understood murderers in Washington were hanged and was prepared to accept that outcome. The question for the jury, the prosecutor said, was not whether Tanya was mentally ill, it was whether she perceived the nature and quality of her acts. John Adams, her husband, John Adams, her estranged husband, testified during the trial about how their marriage had deteriorated and Tanya's religious zealotry had intensified. He initially denied having an affair, but then acknowledged that he had been. The full 25-minute tape that Tanya had made her confession to Officers Pittman and Dickinson was played in the court as the final evidence before the prosecution rested. Tanya sobbed as she sat and listened to her voice on tape. It described the full day of February 4th, the driving, the running engine, the parking lots that she'd chosen for their obscurity, the snow attempt, the multiple crossings of the bridge while she waited for traffic to clear. She described pulling over, carrying Christopher to the railing, walking back to the car, getting Ryan. She told the officers, quote, "You can't know why I did it unless you look at my whole life. I know people can't understand. They need to know about me because a lot of other people could be blamed." Close quote. She said that John was a partner to the killings. He had left, and neither of them had been capable of supporting themselves or each other, that they had used people without knowing it, and that they were not loving people or pure in heart. I mean, agreed. On the tape, there were times when her voice appeared calm and times when it broke, and several times she asked the police detective to turn off the recorder. Defense witnesses testified that Tanya's character before the collapse of her marriage had been, she hadn't been insane, they said. Leslie Perrin said that, okay, I know that my friend is insane when she threw those boys off the bridge. She said that Tanya had wanted them to reach the highest level of heaven, and that she had previously assumed insanity required a more visible presentation. No, it can just be insane religious beliefs. Betty McCorkle confirmed Tanya's honesty and competence as a worker, said that she had not directed any anger towards her husband. She felt responsible for the marriage's failure. So 2 psychiatrists testified at length, and one of them was Dr. Corlew, who said that Tanya was feeling doomed and unredeemable, influenced by Satan, consumed by guilt over her failed marriage and unable to meet the standards of her faith. He characterized her as clearly criminally insane on the day of the killings. Dr. Prowadrew testified that Tanya had genuinely believed that she and John were evil, that the boys could not grow up righteous under their influence, and that sending them to eternal glory before the world could corrupt them was not just permissible, it was obligatory. So both psychiatrists noted that Tanya, at the time of their evaluation, was sane but suicidal and in need of continued hospitalization. So her insanity apparently lasted for the 4th and the 5th, but then by the time the psychiatrist evaluated her, she was sane. It went away. Bishop Munson and Dick Gibson both testified about what they had observed and what they had done and not done leading up to the murders. The prosecutor's response to the psychiatric testimony was to argue that the experts had misread the applicable legal standard. Washington's insanity law at the time required that a defendant, in order to be acquitted on grounds of insanity, must have been unable to understand the nature and quality of the act or to know that it was wrong. And Tanya Adams, more argued, had understood both. She knew it was murder. She knew it was illegal. She knew the penalty. She told the police that she was prepared to accept it. She'd spent a full day and night planning it, reconsidering it, and then executing it and ultimately carrying it out with bizarre care, like bundling up her children, kissing them, waiting for traffic to clear, choosing her moment. In other words, she had thought about this. This isn't the act of a person off their rocker. A jury of 6 men and 6 women deliberated for 11 hours across Friday and Saturday, and then they returned guilty verdicts at 6:45 on Saturday. Several jurors and courtroom spectators were reported to cry as the verdicts were announced. One juror said afterwards that none of them had wanted to convict her. They had been required to follow the law of the state that just did not make room for people like Tanya Adams. I don't know what they wanted instead. I'm so curious. The jury foreman called Washington's criminal insanity standard an abomination. The jurors wrote letters to the judge asking that Tanya not be imprisoned, that she be hospitalized instead. That's wild. From her jail cell, Tanya said, "I know the jury did what they had to do. I'm thankful for the judicial system, but I feel that the strict insanity law is such that it doesn't make allowances for people like me. Nothing has changed. 2 life terms won't satisfy justice in this case." Does this sound like the ramblings of an insane woman? Okay, yeah. The judge in the trial was Albert J. Yenkapal. He was born to Czechoslovakian immigrants in 1928 in this little coal mining town called Ronald, Washington. And he'd been on the bench for about 5 years at that time, but he stayed there through the 90s until he died. His colleagues remembered him as a man of fundamental decency. So the judge received these letters from the jurors and a letter from Washington Women's Prison stating that they did not want Tanya Adams at their facility, that they were not equipped to manage her needs, and that they felt confining her to an institution in isolation, because they didn't know how to, manage somebody with mental illness, I guess, would be cruel and unusual treatment, cruel and inhumane treatment. So the judge ignored the prosecution's recommendation of life in prison for killing 2 children, and he sentenced Tanya to lifetime probation. She had mandatory psychiatric treatment for 5 years after she got out of the Eastern State Hospital, and she had to do 6 years of volunteer work at a nursing home. Why are you going to put this woman with vulnerable people? I don't want to be looked after in a nursing home by somebody who threw her children off a bridge. Is that okay? It was the first time in Washington state history that a person convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder received a sentence that included no prison time. Yenkapal said publicly that the legislators needed to revise the insanity standard. The right and wrong test was too narrow and it failed to account for someone like Tanya Adams. So while awaiting trial and sentencing, Tanya had never been held in prison at all. She had been put on a psychiatric hold at the Eastern State Hospital in Medical Lake, Washington, initially, and had been there ever since. She was using an assumed name so that other patients would not recognize her as the woman who had killed her children. That's what she told reporters. She said it was easier that way. She was just another sick person trying to get well. She talked to a newspaper reporter about the activities that she was doing, arts and crafts, piano lessons, roller skating in the gymnasium. She had been voted the prettiest girl on her ward. Okay, Awesome. He had made handmade Christmas cards for friends and gifts of leather belts and macrame for other patients. She attended a Christmas program where a ventriloquist performed with a Pinocchio puppet, and it reminded her that Ryan, the year before, had wanted to see the Pinocchio movie and she had never taken him. We don't feel sorry for you. You did this. She said the year had been hell. She closed the interview by saying, "It's a little crazy here, and even though I'm getting well, I guess this is where I belong." Okay, so the deal was stay in hospital, get well, come out and have a lifetime of probation. So she was released from Eastern State in October 1982, and under an assumed name, she went to community college classes in Spokane, and then she returned to the coast where she grew up. Now, there have been some follow-up stories on her in the years. In 1992, a story reported that she had never remarried and had no other children. She was still on her lifetime probation, and that appeared to go well with no complications for a bit. And then in 2007, she told her community corrections officer that she was having extreme difficulty coping with life. She said she'd accumulated financial problems. She didn't want to return to her home in Shoreline or her job. She spent several weeks at that point in a psychiatric unit in Seattle. The court reminded her that medication compliance was a condition of her probation. You gotta take your meds. There was another follow-up in January 2015. Family members began calling her corrections officer, John Lyles, and reporting that her behavior was erratic. And they were concerned for her safety and the safety of her 88-year-old mother, who was living with her. So her corrections officer, Lyles, and the police officer go to her trailer in Westport, Washington, and found her with her skirt on backwards and trash all over the place around her bare feet. Her speech was irrational. There was a strong smell of mold and urine in the trailer. She told her corrections officers that she was taking her medications and showed him empty pill bottles as proof. I mean, had taken them, I guess. I'm not sure that's proof that you are still taking them. There's nothing there to take. Paramedics took her to the emergency room and, they were like, she can't go back to her trailer. It's not acceptable for human habitation. So she was involuntarily committed. After her commitment, her condition continued to deteriorate. She couldn't care for herself properly. She couldn't maintain appropriate boundaries with the other patients in the hospital. And she was put into jail. So the paper says Tanya Adams was booked into the Franklin County Jail on March 24th, 2015. She, at the time, was 61 years old. She was held on a $2,500 bail. A 2-month sentence was recommended for the probation violation. And that is the last entry in the public record that I can find. I was thinking it's interesting that this lifetime probation that was framed in 1980 as an act of mercy from the institution, it carried no expiration. So there's no point at which the state determined or was able to determine that Tanya had satisfied her obligation and was free. So every mental health crisis, every period of non-compliance, every year in which the management of her psychiatric illness became unmanageable, that constitutes a probation violation, and now you are returned to the legal apparatus of your original conviction. But it's better than going to jail, I guess. What are the answers? Prisons are full of mentally ill people. I would say the vast majority of people in prison would qualify for a mental illness diagnosis of one form or another. So being mentally ill doesn't mean that you're not culpable for your crimes. Anyway, that's the full story. So I will close by saying, sorry for what I said when I was Mormon.